Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. My task is to present you some highlights from core project 6 and maybe also tell you a bit more about where we think the journey is going. And of course, this is a presentation that I give on behalf of the whole core project 6 team, and lots of work been contributed by all the team members. So thank you for that. So just one slide on the background, which will not surprise you. There is still a lot of high expectations around for robotics and sensing. I'm going to use this abbreviation R&S throughout the presentation to revolutionize agriculture all over the world. And of course, we all believe that it will, but there's also quite some uncertainty around that. And the uncertainty has to do with two questions. So first of all, will farmers adopt these technologies? And then if they adopt technology, will they use the technology such that we observe more sustainability in agricultural landscapes? And I think it's probably self-explanatory why you want to think about impacts of robotics and sensing technologies, but maybe it's not so clear why you would ponder about adoption. I don't have too much time, but I shamelessly use this opportunity to advertise my other talk in the PILS lecture from a couple of months ago. If you want to know more about why adoption is an important aspect of the whole story, please look at that on YouTube. Now, what's the agenda for today? I would like to give you a bit of a background of what we know about the adoption of digital technologies and some examples from robotics and sensing, of course. So brief review of the state of the art and then of the contributions that we have been preparing and publishing in CP6. And then move to the impacts. What do we know about them? Also quick look at what is known, but then mainly focusing on what we've done in CP6 and then try to wrap up and tell you what we think this means for the upscaling, which is, of course, what we're interested in. We want to see these technologies being used at scale. So what do we know about technology adoption? And if you look at the literature, there are thousands of papers being published about that all over the world. It's clear that any new technology that a farmer might ponder about adopting or not has to be profitable, at least as profitable as the technology the farmer is using already, ideally more profitable. The thing with new technologies is that it is about the expectation of profits should you adopt them. Yeah? So you cannot easily observe whether the technology will perform on your farm just as well as in an experiment or on your neighbor's farm. So the technology characteristics matter. What does it do? How does it save things that cost you money, like labor or energy or other inputs? So all this depends also on farm-specific constraints. Each farm is a bit different. You have organic farms, you have conventional farms, you have big, large, small farms. And then it also depends on the attitudes of the manager, right? So some people are simply more risk averse than others. And some people don't even care about risks. And importantly, that's something that only recently enters the adoption literature, especially in agriculture, is it matters what your neighbors think. It matters what you think the society expects from you. And what you think others expect from you depends on your social network. So you also look at what others do and what others expect from you, and all that affects somehow your overall evaluation of the new technology. Now, what's new about robotics and sensing technologies is that they do come with new characteristics, and some of these have been discussed around the previous talk. So, for example, trust in the way providers of these technologies might deal with your data. Yeah? Some of this data might be personal or farm-specific. You maybe don't want your competitors to know about that. So all these things are new. And the other new aspect is, of course, you're not sitting anymore in the driver's seat, but someone else or some machine learning algorithm is sitting in the driver's seat. So you need to have trust in that this actually works the way you want. And talking to some farmers, we have interviewed some farmers also say, I enjoy sitting on my tractor, and especially if it's a big and powerful tractor. So maybe some of the fun might go away. And that, of course, also depends on the personal characteristics of farmers. So since we know all this, here's a quick, let's say, look into the literature. Recent study looking at the adoption rates of digital farming technologies among Bavarian small-scale farms. You see it's quite heterogeneous. Some of these things get adopted by half of the farmers, but also others only get adopted by, let's say, 10 to 20% of the farmers. And of course, many of the things I just listed explain the variation in these adoption rates. And you need to look at each technology, at each business proposal in particular in order to understand what's going on. That's what we did in Core Project 6. Essentially, as economists, we usually start from some sort of theory or concept. We then look into the literature. In this case, we also did some meta-analyses of existing adoption studies. We did some observational studies. That means we collect data in the field, or we use secondary data about adoption and analyze that, try to explain what has driven the adoption. You can do experiments with people. We did also that, and you can try to model farms and their adoption behavior, and also that was done in CP6. Just to give you one example of a way to conceptualize, let's say, a weeding robot. Think of two potential goals that you might want to see on agricultural fields, right? Of course, farmers want to see yields, but society increasingly wants to see biodiversity, which could actually be weeds, diverse weeds, but also diverse species of crops on a field. But we know that to some extent there is a trade-off between those goals, right? So at some point when you want to maximize your yield, you must make sure that many plants grow well on your field, and that goes to the detriment of weed biodiversity. So the technology you use can help you navigate along that trade-off curve, and the technology you use can also help you to maybe alleviate the trade-off to some extent. But still, it's probably hard to imagine a technology that completely eliminates that trade-off. So robots could also be thought of as a tool to help you mediate the trade-off. But still, if it's a costly robot, you might want to still think about how often you use it and whether you use it at all and things like that. Yeah. So this is one way of starting to think about from the perspective of a farm how you might want to deal with these decisions. We started, as I said, looking at what others have found out about adoption, and we took a very systematic approach here. So we collected basically all the peer-reviewed studies that looked at adoption all over the world, have a huge literature database, over 500 studies and over 30,000 estimates of adoption all over the world. And we try to, let's say, distill some generalizable messages from this wealth of data. And to the extent that this can be generalized, things like extensions, so services that provide farmers with information about new technologies, access to credit, because you have to finance these technologies, the size of farms, and the education of the farmer always matter, or at least they matter on average. So these factors can be generalized. What we also did is we introduced information about the local economic and environmental contexts in which these studies were done. And we found that some of these factors significantly interact with these adoption determinants. Yeah? So if you are, let's say, a small-scale farmer somewhere in Africa, and you have difficulties having access to credit, and you live so far away from the market that you also don't get much visits from extension agents, you are less likely to adopt. Yeah? So it's important to not just look at the farm, it's also important to look at the economic and environmental context, which somehow will determine whether one or the other farm adopts or not. Yeah? This is a published work, and I think that was a major achievement in the beginning to just, set the basis for what comes next. An example from an observational study is research done by Anna Masteller and other colleagues from the team of Hugo Storm. They wanted to find out how important are these peer effects. I mentioned that in the beginning, so somehow it's not just the farmer, it's also his or her social network. So how important are these peer effects for the adoption of mechanical weeding technologies? Of course, most of these are not robots, but of course, the promise of the weeding robot is that it can be done mechanically. So it's interesting to just look at the determinants of mechanical weeding technology adoption. So what the colleagues did was basically design a pretty innovative survey instrument. It works online and it's linked to maps and polygons of plots. So farmers could basically identify their plots and their neighbors' plots in a map and tell the researchers what's going on. And actually 313 German sugar beet farmers participated in this big database that then was analyzed using some machine learning techniques. Well, we could later go into the details of what lasso double selection procedures and instrumental variables means, but that's the approach that was used to essentially deal with the fact that it could be that, for example, you adopt because your neighbor adopts, or that you observe your neighbor's field because you have already adopted. And we are interested in, of course, what is the effect of you looking at your neighbors and how that affects your behavior. So that means you need some rather complex econometric approach to identify the actual effect. So what they found out was that it helps for your own adoption of mechanical weeding technology if you know colleagues who also adopt the technology. And it also helps if you run around in your local landscape and see other people using, even if you don't know them, using mechanical weeding in their fields. And to the extent that that affects actually the adoption decisions in the range of 20 to 30 to 40%. So this is a relevant factor. And that comes, of course, on top of whether the whole thing is profitable or not. Implications are here, of course, for the design of advisory services. So if you want to promote something, don't use it like a, don't spread your efforts over the landscape. Try to focus on places where farmers might be using similar crops. So in homogeneous landscapes, the diffusion of these technologies might take place much faster than in very heterogeneous landscapes where farmers grow very different crops and use very different technologies. Of course, insights like this can also be fed into modeling activities. I'm going to talk about modeling later on. If we want to model a farm, we need to know how the decision of one farm depends on the other farms in the landscape. So this helps us to parameterize models that can later help us to explore these dynamics in a virtual environment. Coming to an experimental study, or an example of an experimental study, you can, of course, also create a hypothetical situation and then ask farmers to choose. We did that in one experiment where the question was, what affects weeding robot adoption? So here we actually introduced the weeding robot, but we introduced it along with another technology that was not autonomous. Just that the two technologies had very similar characteristics. The only difference is one is automated, the other one not. That's interesting because we wanted to see, well, to what extent is the automation an important factor? We did this as a so-called incentivized lab in the field experiment with 334 German crop farmers. That means the farmers actually got real payoffs when they made decisions, and payoffs could be in the form of, money that goes into your personal pocket, but could also be payoffs in terms of contributing to some common or public good, like an NGO that then invests in nature conservation. Because we wanted to see how important is it actually, whether it goes into your own pocket or whether it goes as a contribution to society. Interestingly, what we found out is that attitudes of farmers, so how important is it for me to contribute to environmental conservation, how innovative am I, and do I trust in giving away my data? These factors mattered more than the policy incentives that we introduced. So we basically said, well, the weeding robot or the spot spraying might be somewhat less profitable than the broadband application that you already know. But what if the government decides to subsidize that because it does something good to society? That wasn't so interesting for the farmers. The other factors mattered more. Yeah? Now you could think about, okay, well, it will depend on how much you offer to the farmer as a subsidy. That's true. If you, but the more you offer, the more expensive the policy. So you want to think about that and design it carefully. And also interestingly, and again, confirming what we knew about adoption in general, the social and personal norms are important for uptake. It's important what other people or what you think other people think about you or what you think society wants you to do. That influences some people's decision more than others. So there are, of course, policy implications for that. You might want to think to carefully design your incentives that you provide with policies, but this information can again also be used to inform our modeling efforts later on. Now, one example from modeling adoption. In this study, the colleagues from Thomas Heckelei's group looked at how much are farmers likely willing to pay for an automated weeding technology. And this is interesting because in a model, you can assume away all these behavioral factors and focus just on profitability. Or you can control which aspects of behavior you allow for in the decision. In this case, it was really just a profit perspective. So how was this done? There were interviews with weeding robot companies. There was some secondary data being used. We also used some information obtained from fields in which robots are being used within PhenoRob. And then Monte Carlo simulation was done, several simulations with varying parameters of costs and benefits. And the interesting outcome is that organic farms are likely to pay significantly more, or willing to pay significantly more than conventional farms for weeding robots. Why is that? It's perhaps partially obvious. They are not allowed to use other means to reduce weed pressure. Often it has to be done manually or mechanically, and of course you save a lot of labor costs if you had a machine that does that. Conventional farms do not generally have that constraint, so regulatory environments and farm orientation matter a lot when it comes to likely future investments in these technologies. So let me quickly wrap up this section on adoption and what we think we've learned from this. So most German farmers, and let's assume for a second now that our samples are roughly representative. Often they are not, because farmers that are interested in new technologies are more likely to participate in our surveys, of course. But this is not just based on our experiments here. So they look at these technologies with interest, but also with some suspicion. And we get that also from comments in our surveys and from interviews with farms. There's a relatively low willingness to trade off profit for societal and environmental benefits, because actually farmers think that they are doing a lot for society already. So why should they then still trade off their own profit for additional benefits? The economic and the regulatory context matters. Others have found that as well. Example is the robot supervision requirement in the EU. But here it was mainly about, what inputs are farms allowed to use or not, depending on how they call themselves. So organic farms face different constraints and prices, of course, also than conventional farms. And successful on-farm demonstration is key to convince farmers that something is really working in practice. Now, moving to impacts. Let's assume we are in a world where all farmers are eager to adopt these technologies and the technologies are competitive with existing technologies. Then one key insight from prior work on environmental impacts, or generally impacts of modern agricultural technologies, is that there are always secondary, often unintended impacts of technology adoption. If your primary goal was to, increase the yield or reduce the cost of weeding, you might achieve that, but there will also be other effects because, as we said in the beginning, it depends on how farmers use the technology, how often they use it, how intensively they use it, where they use it. So there's no way around accepting that there are unintended secondary impacts. These secondary impacts are conditional on technology characteristics and use, I said that. And importantly, these negative impacts often accrue as externalities. So these are impacts that are often not taken into account by farmers. The best example is what happens to insect diversity. In Germany, there are these famous papers that showed us how much that has reduced over time. This is an effect that accrues to all of us, not just the farmer, and that's why what the farmers do not take into account all the implications of that. Another example would be nutrient runoff. Yeah, so that's a problem, and that implies that it's not just enough to provide a new technology. You probably also need to do something else to avoid that these secondary impacts are worse than the primary impact you wanted to achieve. Again, here we have used in the core project 6 variety of methods. Again, we started with more conceptual ideas. We then did early observational studies. We also did an experiment, and we are working on a sophisticated modeling platform that I'll briefly present at the end. To give you an example, here is one way of hypothetically thinking about upscaling pathways of automated weeding. You could look at the market share of automated weeding, that's the orange line here, and usually these processes happen over time and follow an S-curve. So they start, and then you have a speed up phase, and then somehow you have a saturation at the end. But if you look at a secondary outcome, like the carbon footprint of farming, and assume that we're looking at an organic farm here, then you might see, well, the market share is going up, more and more organic farms are using a weeding robot. If that goes ahead, then you follow the S-curve. If it doesn't, it's a straight line, and market share never becomes very big. But then you look at the green line and see, okay, so they are substituting manual labor by machines that are automatically driving, so they can use many of those machines, weed much more often. And that affects the overall carbon footprint of the organic farm. Yeah, so your intention was not to do anything to the carbon footprint. Your intention was to substitute manual labor. But the outcome is you do both. You substitute and you also affect the carbon footprint. So other, let's say, decisions or other strategies must be implemented to make sure that, for example, the robots run on renewable energy and other things. So many things can happen if you introduce a new technology into a running system. The first observational study I'd like to show you actually shows that this happens in fact. So we had to look at a farm robot that already has some reasonable levels of dissemination. So we looked at the dairy sector where milking robots are being used already for quite some time. And Martinsen, also from Hugo Storm's team, has collected data from 320 Norwegian dairy farms covering period from 2013 to 2019. And what they find is, again, using sophisticated econometric techniques to actually identify the causal effect of adoption of milking robots, that the adoption reduces the eco-efficiency of the farm. Because if you have a robot taking care of that, you use less labor and you can keep more animals. So you expand your herd. That has, of course, an effect on the environmental performance of the whole operation. And on average, the longer you work with your milking robot, the stronger the negative effect on eco-efficiency. That's actually something you might want to think of when you introduce that. To what extent this is a desired effect? Yeah, of course, that depends on what the ecological indicators are you put into the equation, and whether you can live with those ecological effects at the benefit of having more milk and more animals or not. And that's the decision that society must take, that the farmer cannot just take alone. So this is an example where, theoretical reasoning is being confirmed by observational empirical research. We also wanted to do some experimental studies and then had to look to places where this can be done. In this case, we wanted to see to what extent, you remember perhaps the finding from the meta-analysis in the beginning. So extension is important. One way digitalization can revolutionize extension is by not having to visit each and every farmer by car, but maybe to send them messages over WhatsApp or cell phones or whatever other mechanism. We found a partner to do that in Haiti, and we did, and this is an innovation, most randomized control trials, that's what RCT stands for, are done once. And there is a considerable criticism with respect to the validity of one round RCT. So we were able to do 2 rounds. Dario Schulz did that with our partner, working with over 1,000 peanut farmers. And the treatment basically was to send them good practice advice via SMS over 2 growing seasons. Frustratingly, the SMS advice didn't have a very strong effect on first overall knowledge about potential practices, the adoption of those practices, or the actual yields achieved using or not using those practices. So it's not enough to send an SMS. The personal contact probably matters. That works has been shown by many other adoption studies. Of course, experiments like this can be done much more frequently once these technologies become commercially available. Now, an important step that was done by Lin-Mei Shang and others in Thomas Heckelai's team was to actually build the basis for large-scale modeling of adoption processes. In order to model that, you have to look at a whole region. You have to see how individual farmers behave over time. So it's a complex and computation intensive exercise. And we wanted to see how we can overcome these computational challenges in agricultural technology assessment. And what was done was that a machine learning based surrogate of a rather complex farm level optimization model was built. And you can see here that you need to create a significant number of data samples first with your complex farm model. But once you've done that, you can fit a number of different models that, let's say, starting from 100,000 samples, can then replicate the original complex model quite well, and at astonishing increases in computational capacity that, depending on the model, was between 250 to 200,000 times faster than the original model. Now, why is that cool? Because what we can do now is we can model hundreds of farmers, somehow replicating their individual settings in the landscape and how they interact with each other using the surrogate model instead of having to run the complex optimization model all the time when we want to see how the landscape evolves over time. So this was a key step we wanted to achieve in the process. What were our lessons learned? And then I quickly sum up with some more forward-looking thoughts. Secondary impacts or unintended impacts are likely when technologies are designed with good environmental intentions. So it's not enough to just have that in mind. You also have to look at how they're being used. There are limits to the use of digitalized means for extension and knowledge transfer. Somehow people must be involved. There is a need to expand these observational and real-world experiments as soon as our technologies become commercially available. And clearly there's a methodological frontier here, and surrogate modeling to boost the power of agent-based modeling for technology impact assessment is one way to go. And it's actually the way we want to go when we move ahead. The model that has been developed by Sebastian Rasch has already a name. It's called AgriAdopt. It's an agent-based model that builds on the state-of-the-art of knowledge on human behavior. So we can model the factors we have been testing in our empirical studies. It uses a number of multiple novel data sources and is then able to analyze and simulate robotics and sensing adoption and the impacts with farm-level detail at a regional scale. So we want to use all the knowledge we have generated, not just us, but also others, in order to be able to simulate all this and eventually at the end also be able to link this farm-level detailed model to other modeling domains in PhenoRob. Just an example of how this looks like. It has been can be initialized, let's say, at the level of North Rhine-Westphalia. We have real-world data on 500,000 plots from 25,000 farms. The blue dots here represent experimental farms where some data is available, and the initial focus will essentially be on modeling impacts of changes in available technology and characteristics of these technologies, trying to see what happens when you introduce policies like pesticide regulations or incentives for the use of new robots, or maybe even changes to the robot supervision regulation. And we want to see to what extent these factors then affect spatial diffusion of technologies, maybe the speed of diffusion and also the market penetration, how that affects regional crop supply, but perhaps also demand for labor. So also the economic and maybe also some ecological outcomes. Of course, once we know that, it's easy to link this to agroecological models that are much more detailed in simulating impacts. So in a nutshell, we have done the first step. We have scaled up our modeling capacity. The next steps are integrating the knowledge and data from all the observational experimental work in PhenoRob and beyond, linking to other modeling domains to the extent possible. That it also includes the digital agricultural avatars, and then actually use our virtual laboratory to explore robotic and sensing upscaling scenarios. And I think that was already 32 minutes, so I'll stop here and look forward to questions.